When and where were you born?
I was born in December 1951 in Nagoya, Japan. Yeah, my dad was in the Air Force, so I was born in Japan.
What were your parents' political beliefs? What political organization were they involved in?
I would say, I know for sure my dad was a Democrat because he was a big Lyndon Johnson supporter. And then moving forward, he actually quit voting as like a protest to who was running. So, and I do know that he definitely didn't like Ronald Reagan. So my dad was a Democrat. Honestly, I'm not sure about my mom. I would say she probably was a Democrat too, but I don't know for sure. I don't ever remember having any political discussions with my mom. So, but my dad had an opinion.
Okay. Growing up, describe the community you grew up in.
I grew up in suburban Houston. Every other house looked the same, little two-bedroom frame homes, very middle class. Most of the moms stayed home, the dads went to work. But when I was in the second grade, my mother started teaching school at my school. So I feel like my mom was one of the only working moms of any of my friends. Most of my friends' moms didn't work. So it was a very middle class, happy-go-lucky growing up in the 60s. I could ride my bike anywhere. I felt safe. My neighborhood was very white. There were no minorities in my neighborhood at all. And I moved a bit later to New Orleans and was in school with black people for the first time. It completely freaked me out. So yeah, I had a very happy little 60s childhood growing up.
What was school like for you? What did you like about it, and what was hard about it for you?
Well, I loved school. I loved everything about school. I had lots of friends. This is like in grammar school. I don't remember disliking anything about school. Maybe homework. I wasn't crazy about homework, but I would come home and do my homework and then go out and play. So I don't remember disliking anything about school, really. As in grammar school, middle school is torture for everyone, I think. But still, as far as the school, I always enjoyed learning. I liked school. It was fun. I liked school all the way through college. I enjoyed all my schooling.
In your teenage years, what were your favorite subjects? Any particular interests?
So when I was a teenager, I definitely enjoyed science, which kind of led me to my career. I was a dental hygienist, so I did well in science. I hated math. I enjoyed literature and English a lot. So yeah, those were the things I liked.
Okay. This is the advanced question. What was your parents' advice rules related to dating, contact with the opposite sex? Did they give you the birds and bees lecture? Did you get teaching on this in church or school? What was it?
Well, I think it was probably typical for the time that nobody talked about sex ever when I was young. I never had a discussion with either one of my parents about sex until after I was grown and married. I did not get the talk from either one of my parents. My mother gave me a book at some point, I think when I was like in the 5th or 6th grade. As far as dating, my parents divorced when I was 11, and we moved from Houston, where I grew up as a child, to New Orleans, which is where my mother was from. And so my dad wasn't in the picture, and my mother was very lenient. I was a good kid. I never got in any trouble. I was honest and responsible, and my mother gave me a lot of leeway. So she never, mean, I started dating when I was 14. I started going on car dates with boys when I was 14. It's a very different life in New Orleans, very kind of wild and crazy. And I grew up in that when I was in high school. The drinking age was 18. So, you know, my mother let me drink. She was very lenient, but I never got in trouble either. I was responsible and made good choices and all of that. So, and I also think, looking back, I've thought many times I was really glad my dad wasn't there, because he would not have been that way. He would have been way more picky about who I went out with and where I went and what time I got home. I never had a curfew, and I never gave my own children a curfew growing up. I just felt like, you know, when it was time to come home, and don't do anything you're not supposed to be doing. And you could, you know, the time was kind of arbitrary for me. They did have to wake me up when they came in, but my children didn't have a curfew, I guess probably mainly because I never had one. But I ratted the streets in New Orleans. My friends and I would go to the French Quarter. And this is when I was a teenager. I was, 15, 16, 17 years old doing all of this. So I'm very kind of, looking back now, it's kind of alarming compared to what parents, I think, deal their children now. But it's a different world we live in too. It was still, I feel like, relatively safe back in the 60s. So, so anyway.
Okay, we're on 7 now. Marriage. What was originally the most difficult for you about being married and in a relationship? What was most satisfying about marriage?
Well, I married very young initially, and looking back now, it's just because all my friends were getting married. I felt like, oh, well, I need to get married too, so I did. I didn't think it was hard at all. I was only 20. I just graduated from dental hygiene school. I didn't think it wasn't hard. I got along with my first husband pretty well. I mean, we never fussed or anything. I mean, things got complicated on down the road, but it was fun. It was, I was on my own and had my own little house, and I enjoyed being a wife, and certainly I think, one of the major satisfactions of being married is having a family, and so I really enjoyed it. I had my son fairly young, I think 25. I think that's pretty young compared to today's standards. I loved every minute of it, and it was fine. Yeah, it was all good. So.
The camera's picking up Peyton's face. Children, does your family have any heirlooms or objects of sentimental value? What's the origin, and how's it been passed down?
Yes, well, as far as passed down from, like, way back, no. But I have things that I got from my grandparents that my kids already have dibs on, like they are going to be passed down. So I don't feel like I had anything really passed down to me except just from my grandparents, not any further back than that. I have some artwork that my grandmother did, it's hanging on my wall over there, that she painted in 1917. It's dated, so it's 100 years old now. There's some jewelry that belonged to each of my grandmothers, and a bunch of old photos. I have tons of old photos that I know I should have digitized or something, but even if I had them digitized, I would still keep them, so, I couldn't throw them away, because I have a lot of old photos. So I don't think, my grandparents or my parents were very sentimental, but I think my sister and I are, and we have an affinity for things that they had. So.
Okay.
This table is my grandma's.
And now we're on to the overview and evaluation. Just 2 more.
Okay.
Did you support or oppose the war in Vietnam? How did you express your political opinion?
Well, I was still a teenager for most of Vietnam. And so I grew up watching it on the news. Obviously, you think war is bad, but I had no real understanding. And I think a lot of Americans did not have a real understanding of what the war in Vietnam was about. I mean, supposedly it was fighting communism, but of course I've since learned that it was way more complicated than that, and really was a lot longer than just what people look at the Vietnam era. I wore a POW bracelet. My POW came home. So I would say I was against the war just because I knew people, I didn't have any close friends that were killed, but people in my neighborhood, young men in my neighborhood were killed. They would put like black wreaths on the door. And I know all the young men that were of age were all in a panic about how to avoid going to Vietnam. And so it seemed like a bad deal, but I had no real understanding of what it was about or anything like that. So, yeah, it was a very complicated, it was a crazy time. The 60s were a crazy time. There was a lot of unrest and a lot going on, and it was just part of, a big social kind of upheaval back then that, I was a teenager. I didn't have a full grasp of. So
That was a good one. And the last one, do you remember your first contact with such significant inventions as radio, television, or computer? When did you first buy these items?
Okay, well, about a television, I grew up with a TV, but it was a big deal when we got a color TV. I thought we were rich when we got a color TV, because the only people I knew that had color TVs were, to me, were rich people. So, big deal when we got a color TV. The other thing I remember, my mother, like I said, was a school teacher, and when calculators came out, she had to save up money to buy a calculator to average grades, and it was a big deal. It cost like $100, which in the 60s was a lot of money. And all it did would add, subtract, multiply, and divide. It didn't do anything else. It just did basic math. So I remember looking back on that. And then, computers, quite honestly, I was hoping I was old enough to never have to learn how to use a computer when they started coming up. I was like, I don't want any part of that. But obviously, I had to learn how to use a computer. Although, they are convenient for some things, but I think life was better before computers. I just do. I'm really not a fan of technology. I think it causes more trouble than it fixes. I'm old. I wish I had been too old to learn how to use a computer. So I'm going to say, when did I get a computer? It was in the 80s. Maybe, I don't know, maybe like 91, thereabouts. I don't know for sure. And it was expensive. It was like $3,000. And we hired somebody to build it. It wasn't like you didn't go to Best Buy and buy one. And it was, I don't know, it was a pain really. So computers have improved obviously, but I don't know about technology. So there we go. There's that.
Cool.